Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. I never expected that a quiet Tuesday afternoon could turn into something that would linger in my mind for months, maybe years. My name is Eleanor, and I'm a woman who's crossed the threshold of 40, walked a fair share of life's uneven roads, and somehow learned to appreciate the small, ordinary moments. Yet, on that particular day, something small and ordinary decided it wasn't going to stay that way. It began with a simple email from him, Mark, my colleague at the architectural firm I've worked at for nearly 15 years. Mark was always practical, precise, and somewhat reserved, the kind of man who rarely asked for favors, but when he did, you could tell it was important. His email was brief. Could you help me with a client presentation? I'd like something simple, nothing fancy. Let me know if you have time this afternoon. Simple. That word stuck with me. Simple, he said. And I assumed it would be the kind of simple that meant a few tweaks on a PowerPoint deck, a glance at some numbers, a little proofreading. Nothing that would stretch into hours or require too much thought. So, I replied without hesitation, of course. I can come by around 3. The office was unusually quiet when I arrived, sunlight spilling through the tall windows and casting long shadows across the polished floors. The city outside hummed softly, muffled by the double glass panels. Mark's office smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, warm and grounding, a comfort I hadn't expected to feel in a professional setting. He looked up from his desk, his expression calm but with a flicker of something I couldn't place at first, a vulnerability, maybe, or just the intensity of focus. Thanks for coming, he said, his voice low, deliberate. I really just need your perspective. I want to make sure this presentation is clear, concise. Nothing flashy. We started reviewing the slides, and at first, it was as expected, straightforward charts, bullet points, and text that needed tidying. But as we went through it, I realized that he wasn't just asking for professional input. His questions, the way he paused to listen to my suggestions, the subtle tilt of his head when he disagreed, he was inviting more than just help. There was a quiet trust in the room that made me want to stay, to be helpful, to see things through with him. At some point, the simple task began to feel more like a conversation between two people discovering something together. He asked about my thoughts on the client's preferences, my experience with past projects, even my approach to problem solving. The discussion drifted naturally into anecdotes from previous jobs, shared frustrations about deadlines, and laughter over minor mishaps that had nothing to do with work. The room, initially stiff with professional etiquette, became warm with ease. I caught myself noticing details about him I hadn't before, the way he leaned back in his chair when he was thinking, the soft cadence of his voice when he explained a complex idea, and even the tiny crease between his brows when he was focused. There was something quietly magnetic about his presence, and it surprised me because I had always thought of Mark as strictly professional. There were no overt gestures, no unspoken promises, just the kind of connection that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. Hours passed without us noticing. The presentation, which we had expected to finalize in an hour, became a backdrop to an evolving dialogue. He listened, genuinely listened, when I shared opinions, and I found myself doing the same, not just about work, but about our lives in subtle ways. I learned he'd recently taken up photography, that he loved early morning walks before the city woke, and that he had a quiet appreciation for jazz music. These weren't things I would normally know about a coworker, but there was an intimacy in sharing small truths, the kind that felt safe yet significant. Eventually, we paused to stretch, standing by the window and looking out over the skyline. The city lights were beginning to flicker as the afternoon faded into evening, painting the streets below with gold and amber. I realized then that what had started as a simple favor had become much more. Not complicated in a chaotic sense, but complicated in that it had awakened a part of me that had been dormant for years, the part that yearned for connection, for understanding, for recognition that went beyond routine tasks and polite conversation. Mark's voice brought me back from my reverie. I didn't realize it would take so long, he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I guess simple isn't always simple. I laughed softly, feeling an odd warmth that had nothing to do with the office temperature. Apparently not, I said. And in that moment, we both understood something unspoken, that a favor, a small act of help, had shifted into something unexpectedly meaningful that we finished the presentation together. Yes, but the memory of those hours lingered long after the slides were sent to the client. What was meant to be a routine task had blossomed into a subtle, emotional journey. I left the office that evening with a sense of anticipation and curiosity, knowing that something had changed between us, something gentle but profound, and I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I wanted to see. The next morning, I woke with a strange mix of anticipation and calm. I had replayed yesterday's hours in my mind more times than I could count, noticing the small details, the way Mark's hand rested on the table as he gestured, the faint scent of cedar in his office, and the way his eyes seemed to hold questions he didn't voice aloud. I told myself it was just a professional connection, a fleeting moment magnified by solitude in the office, yet there was a quiet tug in my chest that insisted otherwise. I arrived at the office a little earlier than usual, hoping to get a head start on my own work. The city was still stretching itself awake. Sunlight peeked through the tall glass buildings, glinting off the sidewalks. It struck me how ordinary mornings could carry an extraordinary sense of possibility if you were willing to notice. I had learned that yesterday Mark was already at his desk when I walked by. He looked up, and that same subtle warmth appeared in his expression, the one that made you feel both seen and welcomed without a word. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of something more relaxed than the usual professional greeting. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my heart had picked up a beat or two. He gestured toward the stack of client files beside his monitor. "I thought we could review some of these before the next meeting. Nothing major, just your perspective. I really value it." There was that word again, perspective. Simple, he had said yesterday, but what he truly seemed to want was more than a simple glance at charts or numbers. He wanted engagement, someone who would see the project as he did, who could understand the nuances and subtle complexities. And in that, I realized, lay the complication. Simple favors were rarely simple when emotions got involved. We spent the morning diving into the files, discussing proposals, refining graphs, and considering client preferences. But as before, our conversation wandered. He shared stories about his family, memories of childhood summers by the lake, quiet evenings spent reading. I shared moments of my own, small adventures I'd taken, challenges I'd faced, the little victories that often went unnoticed. The office seemed to shrink around us, fading into the background as the exchange grew more personal, more revealing. At one point, we paused to take a stretch, standing by the window that looked out over the city streets below. Mark leaned lightly against the frame, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside had slowed down. "You know," he said softly, "I didn't expect yesterday to be this engaging. Simple, I thought. But it seems simple is rarely simple." I smiled, feeling that familiar warmth spreading through me. "I suppose life has a way of complicating things when you least expect it," I replied. There was no flirtation in my tone, no hidden agenda, just a genuine acknowledgement of the connection forming between us. As the day progressed, I noticed that our collaboration had grown into a rhythm, a shared understanding that went beyond words. We would glance at each other across the desk, sometimes laughing quietly at a small mistake, sometimes pausing to consider a different perspective. It was subtle, but the emotional resonance was undeniable. There was trust, respect, and an almost imperceptible intimacy in the way we worked together. By late afternoon, the tasks were done, yet neither of us moved to leave. There was a pause, an unspoken hesitation, the kind that happens when both people sense something meaningful unfolding but are unsure how to define it. "I appreciate your help, Eleanor," Mark said finally, his tone gentle. "More than I expected." I nodded, my thoughts mirroring his sentiment. "And I appreciate yours," I said. "It's rare to have this kind of collaboration, you know? Where work and understanding meet." He smiled, and for a fleeting moment, the office felt like a quiet sanctuary, removed from deadlines, emails, and expectations. I realized then that the complication wasn't in the work, it was in the human connection that had quietly deepened. It wasn't just a favor, it wasn't just assistance, it was a shared space of understanding, where honesty and attention mattered more than efficiency or outcomes. When I finally left the office that evening, the city was bathed in a golden hue, the kind of light that makes every ordinary street corner seem enchanted. I walked slowly, letting the warmth of the day and the memory of our shared hours settle over me. What had begun as a simple task had transformed into something far more intricate, an emotional resonance that I hadn't anticipated but welcomed wholeheartedly, and somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was only the beginning. The complication was not a problem to solve, but a journey to experience, a subtle, unfolding story that neither of us had planned but both of us had stepped into willingly. The following week, our interaction began to settle into a rhythm that felt both familiar and charged with a quiet tension I couldn't quite name. Each morning, I looked forward to walking into the office, not for the work itself, though the projects were important, but for the subtle sense of anticipation that came with seeing Mark. There was a gentle comfort in our routine, yet beneath it, I could feel the undercurrent of something more profound. That Tuesday, he asked me to join him in a meeting with a particularly demanding client. He had mentioned it casually in the hallway, his tone almost conversational, but I could sense a hint of hesitation, as though he wasn't entirely sure if he wanted me involved. "It's nothing too complicated," he said. "I just value your input. Simple, really. Simple." The word had become almost ironic. Because with Mark, nothing ever felt entirely simple. And I found that I didn't want it to be. We sat in the client's office, a bright space filled with sleek furniture and modern art, but I barely noticed the surroundings. My attention was drawn to the subtle ways Mark interacted with people, the gentle nods, the patient listening, the careful way he phrased questions so as to invite conversation rather than dominate it. There was an elegance to the way he worked, an ease that made the room feel less like a battlefield of negotiations and more like a space of understanding. I contributed where I could, offering observations and suggestions, but more than that, I watched him. There was a quiet confidence in his presence that inspired trust, and I felt a deep admiration growing in me, not for his accomplishments, but for the thoughtful, considerate way he approached the world. And when he glanced at me with that subtle, almost imperceptible smile, I knew he recognized something in me as well, a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement that this moment wasn't just professional, but quietly personal. After the meeting, we returned to his office. The air was lighter now, the tension of client negotiations released, leaving behind only a sense of calm. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms, and I noticed the faint creases of exhaustion at the corners of his eyes. "You handled yourself well," he said quietly. "Better than I expected." I smiled, a warm, unguarded smile that mirrored the sincerity in his voice. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without you guiding the discussion." There was a pause, a brief silence that felt charged with possibility. I wanted to speak, to comment on the way our dynamic had changed, but the words felt inadequate, too simple for the complexity of what I was experiencing. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence carry its own meaning. As the days passed, the subtle tension between us grew, not in an uncomfortable way, but in a way that demanded awareness. Our conversations began to drift from projects to shared experiences, books we'd read, music that moved us, even memories of our childhoods. Mark revealed his love for quiet mornings, the kind where the world feels paused and everything is still. I shared my affinity for walks at dusk, when the sun dips low and paints everything in shades of gold and amber. It wasn't just talk, it was a form of connection that went deeper than small talk or office pleasantries. It was recognition of each other as people, not just colleagues. And the more I discovered about him, the more I realized how little I had known about the man I thought I understood. There was depth, warmth, and an authenticity that drew me in. One evening, as we were leaving the office together after a long day, the streets glistened with the reflection of city lights on rain-washed pavement. We walked in companionable silence, the kind that only forms between two people who feel equally comfortable and attuned to one another. At one point, he looked at me and said, "I didn't expect this, not like this." I felt a quiet laugh rise in my chest, not of amusement but of relief. "Neither did I admitted. But maybe that's the beauty of it. Some things aren't planned, and that's what makes them meaningful." He nodded, a small, contemplative gesture. "I suppose you're right. Simple, as I said, but never really simple, is it?" "No," I agreed, smiling. "Not simple at all." And in that moment, walking side by side beneath the city lights, I realized that what had begun as a favor, a simple act of helping with a presentation, had transformed into a journey of discovery for both of us. The complexity wasn't something to fear, it was a gift. A chance to understand another person, to connect on a level that went beyond work, beyond routine, into something deeply human. That night, I lay in bed replaying the day's events, feeling a quiet gratitude for the unexpected. What had started as a straightforward, simple task had evolved into a meaningful connection that was slowly reshaping my understanding of companionship, trust, and the beauty of subtle emotional intimacy. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I welcomed the uncertainty. The complication, I realized, wasn't a problem, it was a path, one that neither of us had planned but both of us were beginning to walk together. And that thought alone carried a gentle, lingering sense of hope. The following week felt different, though nothing about the office had changed. The sunlight streamed in as usual, the hum of the city below remained constant, and the familiar scent of cedar and coffee lingered in Mark's office. Yet, for both of us, there was an unmistakable awareness in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that our connection had grown into something meaningful, something we couldn't easily define. We were working on the final details of a major project, the one that had been looming over us for months. The client's expectations were high, and the deadlines tight, but the tension that might have weighed us down in the past seemed lighter now, tempered by the trust and understanding we had built. There was a rhythm to our collaboration, a gentle synchronicity that made even the most demanding tasks feel manageable. During a break, we found ourselves at the window again, looking out over the city as the afternoon sun turned the streets to gold. Mark leaned slightly against the frame, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about how things start?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. I turned to him, intrigued. "How things start?" "Yes," he said, glancing at me with a hint of a smile. "A small decision, a simple favor, and somehow it becomes more meaningful than we could have imagined. Do you ever wonder why that happens?" I considered his words, the memory of our first day working together replaying in my mind, the email, the simple request, the hours that turned into conversations and shared moments. "I think it's because when people are open, really open, even small gestures carry weight," I said softly. "They become the moments where connection happens. And once it begins, it can't be undone." He nodded, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The city seemed to hold its breath, as if acknowledging the significance of our shared reflection. There was no pressure, no expectation beyond the present, yet I felt a profound sense of clarity. We had begun with something simple, but we had discovered a depth that neither of us had anticipated. As the week drew to a close, we wrapped up the project and sent the final presentation to the client. There was a sense of accomplishment, yes, but also something quieter, more enduring, the knowledge that our collaboration had become a foundation for something more personal, a bond that extended beyond spreadsheets and PowerPoint slides. Before leaving the office on Friday, Mark turned to me, a thoughtful expression in his eyes. "Eleanor, I want to thank you. Not just for the work, but for everything else. The perspective, the conversation, the understanding. I didn't expect this, but I'm glad it happened." I felt a warmth spread through me, a gentle recognition of the journey we had shared. "I feel the same," I said. "It's rare to find someone you can connect with, not just professionally, but as a person." "I'm grateful too." We walked toward the elevator together, the quiet hum of the office around us. As the doors closed, I realized that our connection was no longer about a simple favor or a single project. It was about trust, respect, and the subtle intimacy of shared understanding. It was about two people who had discovered that meaningful connections often begin in the most unassuming ways. That weekend, I reflected on the week's events while taking my usual evening walk. The streets were calm, the light fading to a soft amber, and I felt a quiet sense of peace. Life had a way of complicating what seemed simple, and perhaps that was its greatest gift. What mattered wasn't simplicity or complexity, it was authenticity, the moments where people truly saw and appreciated one another, and in that understanding, I found a sense of closure and anticipation all at once. Closure, because I had experienced something genuine and rare. Anticipation, because even though the path ahead was uncertain, I knew that our connection, built on trust, respect, and shared experience, would continue to grow in ways neither of us could predict. As I turned the corner toward home, I felt a quiet smile tug at my lips. What had begun as a simple favor had become an unexpected journey of discovery, and I realized that the most meaningful moments in life were often the ones you never planned for, the ones that quietly shape who you are and how you see the world. The story of that week, of Mark and me, of a favor that became so much more, would stay with me for years, a gentle reminder that life's complications are sometimes the very moments that bring the deepest rewards.